No nanny lasted more than a month at the Sterling mansion. Some were driven away by the oppressive silence, a quiet so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Others fled from the ghost of a child who haunted its halls, a little girl named Lily, who existed in a state of perpetual twilight. But most left because of the father, Julian Sterling, a man who had built an empire from silicon and code, but couldn't bridge the fathomless chasm separating him from his own daughter. He was one of the richest men in the country, a titan of industry whose face graced magazine covers, but no amount of money could fix the broken stillness in his 6-year-old's eyes. After firing the 7th specialist in as many months, his desperation was a palpable force, a cold draft in the cavernous, sterile rooms of his home. Then a woman named Clara Mayweather arrived. She was not a specialist, not a nurse, not a therapist. She was a housekeeper, her application forwarded by an agency that was running out of options. She had a painful past, etched in the gentle lines around her eyes, a quiet sorrow that she wore not as a burden, but as a part of her very being. She didn't offer theories or platitudes, she simply offered to clean. Julian, exhausted and cynical, agreed without much thought. He would return home weeks later, intending to dismiss her like all the others, but a sound from the long, silent solarium would completely freeze him in place. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 2 years, a sound he believed he would never hear again. That single moment, that impossible sound, would shatter the foundations of his world and set him on a path to uncover a devastating truth, a betrayal so deep it threatened to destroy what little he had left. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Sterling mansion was less a home and more a mausoleum dedicated to a life that had ended abruptly 2 years prior. Polished marble floors reflected the cold gray light that filtered through cathedral-sized windows. Furniture, exquisite and impossibly expensive, was arranged with the geometric precision of a museum exhibit. There were no fingerprints on the glass tables, no stray cushions on the silk sofas, no life. It was in this pristine tomb that Clara Mayweather began her first day. She had been briefed by the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman whose rigidity was a clear survival mechanism in this house of grief. The rules were simple and absolute. The East Wing, the former domain of the late Mrs. Amelia Sterling, was not to be entered. Mr. Sterling was not to be disturbed in his study, and Lily was to be treated as part of the scenery. The nurses handle her personal care, her feeding, her medication, Mrs. Gable explained, her voice clipped. Your job is to maintain the space around her, dust her room, but do not engage. She is unwell, profoundly. She doesn't see, she doesn't hear, she doesn't respond. The doctors have been very clear. Clara nodded, her expression placid, but her eyes absorbed everything. She saw the prescription bottles lined up on a silver tray, the heavy blackout curtains in the child's room, the utter lack of toys, colors, or anything that spoke of childhood. Lily herself sat in a specialized wheelchair in the corner of the living room, facing a large, dark television screen. She was a beautiful child with her father's dark hair and what must have been her mother's delicate features, but her face was slack, her eyes unfocused and empty. She was a doll left on a shelf, perfect and inanimate. Clara's heart, a vessel all too familiar with loss, ached with a silent, immediate pang of recognition. This wasn't just illness. This was an abyss of loneliness. She began her work, her movements economical and silent. She dusted the grand piano that no one played, polished the silver frames holding pictures of a smiling woman who was no longer there, and vacuumed the plush carpets that muffled every footstep. All the while, she was aware of the small, still figure in the wheelchair. She felt the child's presence not as a void, but as a compressed point of immense gravity, pulling all the silence and sorrow of the house into itself. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, a single ray of light broke through the perpetual gloom, striking the side of a crystal vase. It refracted, casting a brilliant spear of light across the room that landed directly on the wall just beyond Lily's chair. Clara was wiping down a nearby bookshelf when she saw it. Lily's head, which had been perfectly still for hours, turned. It was a minuscule movement, a tremor that lasted less than a second. Her eyes, supposedly blind to the world, shifted ever so slightly in the direction of the light. Anyone else would have missed it. Mrs. Gable would have dismissed it as an involuntary spasm. The nurses, with their clinical detachment, would have noted it as a meaningless reflex. But Clara saw it. She had spent years watching for the smallest signs of life in the face of her own silent child, and she knew it wasn't a spasm, it wasn't a reflex, it was a reaction. In that infinitesimal moment, a seed of suspicion was planted in the fertile ground of Clara's own grief. The doctors, the specialists, the father who had sealed himself away, they were all wrong. Lily wasn't gone. She was trapped. And in the oppressive, suffocating silence of the Sterling mansion, Clara Mayweather had just heard the faintest whisper of a soul calling out for help. Her cleaning rag paused in midair. She looked at the child, then at the fading light on the wall. A quiet, fierce resolve settled over her. She would not be like the others. She would not be driven away by the silence or the sorrow. She would listen. She would watch. And she would wait. Clara understood the nature of fragile things. She knew that trust, like a seedling, could be crushed by too much force or withered by neglect. Her approach to Lily was one of almost reverent patience. She never broke the rules laid out by Mrs. Gable. She did not speak to the child, nor did she touch her. Instead, she began a series of subtle, quiet experiments, weaving them into the fabric of her daily chores. A secret conversation conducted in a language of the senses. Her first experiment was with sound. The house was a vacuum, devoid of music or laughter. The only noises were the hum of the climate control, the distant tapping of Julian Sterling's keyboard, and the hushed, clinical voices of the nurses. Clara carried a melody inside her, a simple lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, and she, in turn, had sung to her own lost son. It was a tune of 5 simple notes, a gentle, ascending, and descending scale of pure comfort. While dusting the room where Lily sat, Clara began to hum it, so softly it was barely audible above the sound of her cloth on the wood. She watched Lily from the corner of her eye. For the first 2 days there was nothing. On the 3rd day, as she hummed the familiar notes, she saw Lily's small hand, which lay limp on the arm of her wheelchair, twitch. A single finger curled and then relaxed. It was the same kind of micro-reaction she'd seen with the flash of light. It was confirmation. Next, she turned to light. She remembered Lily's head turning towards the refracted sunbeam. The child's room was kept perpetually dim, the heavy curtains drawn tight. The official reason was to prevent overstimulation of a supposedly damaged nervous system. Clara suspected it was just another layer of the prison. During her cleaning duties, she found reasons to be near Lily with something that could catch the light. She would polish a silver tea service on the far side of the room, angling it just so, sending a soft, dancing reflection onto the ceiling. She would clean the large windows, momentarily pulling back a corner of the heavy drapes, allowing a sliver of bright morning sun to slice across the carpet. Each time, she watched, and each time she was rewarded. A flutter of eyelids, a slight, almost imperceptible intake of breath, a subtle tensing in the child's shoulders. Lily was a plant starved of sun, still capable of turning towards a hint of brightness. Smell was the 3rd sense she engaged. The mansion smelled of lemon polish and sterile air. It was clean to the point of being lifeless. Clara began to bring small tokens from the world outside. One morning, she tucked a sprig of lavender from the garden into her apron pocket. As she cleaned near Lily, she let the fragrant herbs sit on a nearby table for a few minutes. Another day, after a rainstorm, she brought in a single perfect rose, its petals still beaded with water, and set it in a bud vase across the room. She would watch as Lily's nostrils flared, a tiny, involuntary movement, as the foreign scents disturbed the sterile air. The nurses, a rotating pair of dour women named Agnes and Brenda, paid her no mind. They saw a quiet, efficient housekeeper, a black woman who knew her place and kept to herself. They administered Lily's medication, a milky liquid in a small cup, at 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, their movements practiced and devoid of emotion. They changed her, fed her pureed food, and repositioned her in her chair. They documented everything in a neat, leather-bound logbook, their entries a litany of clinical observations. Subject remained placid, no notable responses, vitals stable. Clara watched them too. She noted the way Lily seemed to shrink into herself just before the medicine was administered, a subtle tightening of her small frame that the nurses either didn't see or didn't care to. The milky liquid seemed to deepen the fog she was in, pulling her further from the surface. Clara's suspicions grew, coalescing into a dreadful certainty. Lily's condition wasn't just being mismanaged, it was being enforced. The sedatives, the lack of stimulation, the perpetual twilight. It was a cage, meticulously constructed and maintained. Her conviction deepened with each passing day, with every twitch of a finger, every flutter of an eyelid. She was gathering evidence, not for a court of law, but for a court of one. She had to find a way to make Julian Sterling see. She had to show him that his daughter was not a ghost, but a prisoner, and that his house was not a sanctuary, but a cell. The key, she felt, was finding a space away from the oppressive watchfulness of the main house, a place where the air was different. And then she remembered the solarium. It was a large, glass-paned room off the main library, filled with the skeletal remains of Amelia Sterling's once thriving collection of orchids and tropical plants. It had been neglected since her death, left to dust and decay. But the light inside was beautiful, filtered and green. It felt alive, even in its neglect. It would be their sanctuary. The solarium became Clara's project. During her allotted breaks, she started bringing the neglected space back to life. She swept away the dried leaves, washed the dusty glass panes until they sparkled, and began the slow, patient work of tending to the surviving plants. She pruned dead branches, repotted orchids in fresh bark, and gave water to roots that were parched and thirsty. The room began to breathe again, the air growing thick with the scent of damp earth and green living things. It was a pocket of warmth and vitality in the cold stone heart of the mansion. She waited for the perfect opportunity. It came on a Tuesday, a week after she started her secret experiments. Julian Sterling was away on an overnight business trip to Zurich. The nurses, Agnes and Brenda, were more lax in his absence, spending more time in the staff kitchen, gossiping over cups of tea. Mrs. Gable was preoccupied with inventory in the wine cellar. The house was quiet. After the morning dose of medication had been administered, and its dulling effect had taken hold, Clara approached the listless child. "Come on, sweet girl," she whispered, the first word she had ever spoken directly to Lily. She gently unlocked the wheels of the chair and, with her heart pounding in her chest, pushed her out of the dim living room, down the hall, and through the doors of the library into the bright, warm embrace of the solarium. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The air was humid, the light was soft and dappled, and the quiet was different. Not the oppressive silence of the house, but a living quiet, punctuated by the imaginary hum of growing things. Clara positioned Lily's chair in a patch of sunlight amidst a grove of recovering ferns. For a long time, nothing happened. Lily remained as she always was, a still life. Clara didn't push. She sat on a low stool nearby, took a small, smooth wooden bird from her apron pocket, a memento from her own past, a tangible link to a love that was gone but not forgotten, and began to polish it with a soft cloth. She started humming her lullaby, the 5 simple notes weaving through the green air. She didn't look at Lily directly, but watched her reflection in the glass panes. She saw the child's head lift a fraction of an inch. She saw her eyelids flicker. The sunlight caught the polished wood of the bird, and a warm, golden gleam danced in the air. And then it happened. Slowly, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength in her small body, Lily raised her right hand. It trembled violently, an unpracticed limb moving through thick water, but it rose. Her index finger, small and pale, uncurled and pointed directly at the wooden bird in Clara's hand. Her eyes, which Clara had only ever seen as vacant and dull, were focused. There was a clarity in them, a spark of unmistakable intent that took Clara's breath away. Time seemed to stop. The air grew thick. Clara's own hand was trembling as she slowly, deliberately, held out the small bird. "Here, baby," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "You can hold it." She moved her hand closer until the bird was just inches from Lily's. The child's fingers, clumsy and weak, made a grasping motion. They brushed against the wood, then failed to close. A tiny, frustrated sound escaped her lips, a whimper so faint it was barely a sound at all. But it was a sound of will, a sound of desire. Clara gently guided the bird into Lily's palm and helped her curl her fingers around it. The small hand closed, its grip surprisingly firm. Lily's eyes fixated on the object she now held, her entire being concentrated on the solid, smooth reality of it. It was the first object she had willingly held in 2 years. It was the first choice she had made. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot and silent. They were tears of vindication, of a grief that had found an echo, and of a fragile, terrifying hope. She looked at the child, truly seeing her for the first time not as a victim, but as a survivor. Lily was in there. She was fighting, and she had just found an ally. In the green, sunlit warmth of the revived solarium, surrounded by the quiet patience of growing things, a bond was forged, a silent pact made between a woman who had lost a child and a child who had lost the world. Julian Sterling returned from Zurich a day early. The deal had collapsed, the flight was turbulent, and he was in a foul mood, his mind a maelstrom of stock prices, legal clauses, and simmering frustration. The silence of his house, usually a balm to his frayed nerves, felt suffocating. He threw his briefcase onto a console table, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous hall. He wanted a drink. He wanted to retreat to his study and lose himself in the cold, hard logic of numbers. But a primal, paternal instinct he usually suppressed pricked at him. Lily. He hadn't seen her before he left. He strode through the living room, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. Her usual corner was empty. A spike of irrational annoyance shot through him. Everything in his life was controlled, scheduled, and precise. The child's location was part of that precision. He found Mrs. Gable, who informed him the nurses were on their break. "The new housekeeper, Clara, is with her," she said, a hint of disapproval in her tone. "She has taken a strange liking to that old solarium." A dark scowl crossed Julian's face. The solarium was his wife's place. He hadn't set foot in there since she died. It was a place of ghosts, a monument to his failure to save her. That a mere housekeeper would take his disabled daughter into that sacred, sorrowful space felt like a violation. He moved towards the library, his strides long and angry, composing the termination speech in his head. He would be calm, cold, and final. He would have her gone within the hour. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the library and crossed to the glass-paned entrance of the solarium. He stopped dead, his hand on the brass handle, the angry words dissolving on his tongue. The scene before him was not what he had expected. The room was transformed, alive with green and dappled sunlight, and in the center of it sat his daughter. But it was not the same daughter he had left 2 days ago. Lily was holding a small carved object in her hand, her gaze fixed upon it with an intensity he had never witnessed. Her posture, usually slumped in a C-shape of surrender, had a subtle tension, an alertness, and the new housekeeper, Clara, was sitting on a low stool nearby, not touching her, not speaking, but humming. It was a simple, gentle melody that seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He stood frozen, a voyeur in his own home, watching a scene that felt both intimate and impossible. He watched as Clara offered Lily a small sip of water from a cup, and Lily, instead of letting it dribble from her lips, as she usually did, swallowed purposefully. Then, as Clara resumed her soft humming, Julian witnessed the miracle. Lily, still looking at the object in her hand, made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a soft, breathy, tonal response. She hummed, a clear, deliberate echo of the melody Clara was singing. The sound, so small, so insignificant to any other ear, struck Julian Sterling like a physical blow. It bypassed his intellect, his cynicism, his carefully constructed walls of grief, and pierced him straight through the heart. It was the sound of connection. It was the sound of a mind at work. It was the sound of his daughter. The rage that had propelled him to the solarium vanished, replaced by a tidal wave of emotions he couldn't name: shock, disbelief, confusion, and a terrifying, fragile flicker of hope. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning slightly. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with alarm, her hand instinctively moving as if to shield the child. Julian ignored her. He walked slowly, hesitantly, towards his daughter's wheelchair, his gaze locked on her face. "Lily," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Lily didn't respond to him, her attention still captivated by the wooden bird. He crouched down, his expensive suit creasing, bringing himself to her level. He could see her eyes were clearer, the fog receded. He looked at the object in her hand. Then he looked at Clara. His expression was no longer one of anger, but of raw, desperate pleading. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a father lost in the wilderness. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What is this?" Clara met his gaze, her own calm but firm. "I didn't do anything, sir," she said softly. "I just paid attention. I think she's been trying to tell us she's still here." Julian looked back at his daughter, then at the humming woman, then back at the impossible, undeniable proof clutched in Lily's small hand. The world he had accepted for 2 years, a world of clinical diagnoses, of permanent loss, of a daughter gone forever, crumbled around him. In its place stood a question, terrifying and wonderful all at once. What if they were all wrong? He made a decision. It was not based on logic or data, but on the sound of a hum and the sight of a tiny hand holding a wooden bird. He stood up, his posture straighter. "Continue," he said to Clara, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual authority, but laced with a new, unfamiliar vulnerability. "Whatever you are doing, continue." A silent understanding passed between the grieving father and the quiet housekeeper. It was not yet trust, not yet a true partnership, but it was a beginning. It was a fragile alliance, forged in a sunlit room full of ghosts and nascent hope. The dynamic in the Sterling mansion shifted overnight. Julian, though still outwardly the reserved and powerful magnate, was now an accomplice in Clara's quiet rebellion. He instructed Mrs. Gable and the nurses that Clara was to be given unrestricted access to Lily and the solarium, framing it as a new form of environmental therapy he was exploring. The explanation was met with skepticism, but his tone brooked no argument. He became a covert observer, watching from the doorway of his study or via the security monitors he now checked obsessively. He saw Clara reading children's books to Lily, her voice a soft, steady murmur. He saw her bring in a small basin of water and scented petals, letting Lily trail her fingers through it. He saw his daughter's hand, once so limp, begin to make more purposeful movements, her head turning consistently toward the sound of Clara's voice. The progress was agonizingly slow, measured in millimeters and whispers, but it was undeniable. Hope, once a dangerous and painful concept, began to take root in the barren soil of his heart. One evening, after the nurses had left and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Julian found Clara in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. "The medical files," he said, his voice abrupt. "Her records. They're in my study. I want you to look at them." Clara looked up, surprised. "Sir, I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't know what to look for." "You see things others don't," Julian stated, his voice flat, a simple statement of fact. "You saw her. I want you to look. See if you see anything now that you didn't see before." It was a profound act of trust, an admission that his world of experts and specialists had failed, and that his only hope now lay in the intuitive wisdom of this quiet housekeeper. The next day, under the guise of giving the cavernous study a deep cleaning, Clara shut the doors and opened the filing cabinet. The drawers slid open with a well-oiled hush, revealing dozens of neatly labeled folders. Lillian Sterling. It was a life reduced to paper, a chronicle of decline. She pulled out the first file, dated just after the accident that had killed Amelia. The initial consultation reports were from a child psychiatrist at the city's top hospital. Clara read through the clinical language, her finger tracing the words. The diagnosis was jarringly different from what she had been told. Patient presents with symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress and elective mutism. Prognosis for recovery is good, with consistent, gentle therapy and a stable, loving environment. Elective mutism, a choice, a retreat from a world that had become too painful. There was no mention of a degenerative neurological disorder, no indication of blindness or cognitive collapse. Clara's blood ran cold. She kept digging. Folder after folder detailed the first few months of therapy, with small, hopeful notes from the psychiatrist. Lily responded to music therapy today. EQ made eye contact for 3 seconds. Then the record stopped abruptly. A new set of files began, 3 months after the first. A new doctor's name appeared, Dr. Alistair Finch, and with him a new diagnosis. Profound catatonic regression, he had written, likely an underlying, previously undiagnosed, degenerative neurological condition triggered by the trauma. Prognosis is extremely poor. Palliative care and management are the only viable options. Clara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. It was here that the medication list changed. The mild anti-anxiety medication prescribed by the first doctor was replaced with a powerful cocktail of antipsychotics and heavy sedatives, haloperidol, risperidone, drugs designed to subdue, to blunt the senses, to chemically imprison. These were the drugs the nurses were still administering twice a day. This was the milky liquid that deepened the fog. It wasn't a treatment. It was a chemical straitjacket. The name of the referring physician who had brought in Dr. Finch was noted at the bottom of the first report, Marcus Thorne. Clara recognized the name instantly. He was Julian's closest advisor, his right-hand man, a constant presence in the house. He was the one who always seemed the most concerned, the most solicitous of Julian's grief, the one who always had a comforting hand on his shoulder. He called him Jules, and spoke of Amelia with a familiar, aching sorrow. He was family. Clara's hands trembled as she held the file. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misdiagnosis. This was a deliberate, systematic dismantling of a child. She searched for something, anything, that spoke of the little girl before the fall. Tucked into the back of the very first folder, she found it. A photograph. It must have been used for hospital identification. It showed a vibrant, laughing 4-year-old Lily, her arms wrapped around her mother's neck. She had bright, intelligent eyes and a mischievous grin. She was the picture of a happy, healthy child. Looking at that photograph, at the ghost of the girl who was trapped inside the silent child in the other room, Clara felt a cold, hard anger crystallize within her. This was not just a family tragedy, it was a crime. She carefully put the files back in order, but not before using her phone to take pictures of the key pages, the first diagnosis, the first therapy notes, the abrupt change in care, the new drug regimen, and the name Marcus Thorne. That evening she waited for Julian to return to his study. She stood before his massive desk, her hands clasped behind her back, and laid out what she had found, not with hysteria, but with a quiet, devastating precision. She told him about the elective mutism, about the hopeful early reports, about the sudden arrival of Dr. Finch and his grim, life-altering diagnosis. She told him about the drugs. Julian listened, his face a mask of stone, but she could see a storm gathering in his eyes. When she finished, he was silent for a full minute. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds of a life that had been stolen. "Marcus brought him in," Julian said, his voice a low growl. "After the first psychiatrist said I needed to cut back my work hours to be present for her therapy. Marcus said the man was a fool, that he was blaming me. He said he'd found the best, a man who understood these complex cases. Dr. Finch," he looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a dawning, unspeakable horror. "He said he was helping me." The fragile alliance had just been forged into a weapon. They now had a target. And Julian Sterling would bring the full weight of his empire down upon it. The assault began with surgical precision. Julian Sterling, the businessman, was a master strategist, and now he channeled all his formidable intellect and resources into a single objective: uncovering the truth about Dr. Alistair Finch. He hired a team of private investigators, the best in the country, and set them to work digging into every aspect of the doctor's life. While they worked in the shadows, Julian scheduled a direct confrontation. He arranged a consultation at the mansion with Marcus Thorne present. He wanted to see them together, to watch their faces as he began to ask the questions Clara had raised. The meeting took place in the formal living room, the same room where Lily often sat in her silent vigil. She was there now, in her chair, with Clara standing discreetly a few feet away. Dr. Finch arrived first, a man with a practiced air of compassionate authority and cold reptilian eyes. Marcus arrived moments later, all warmth and concern, placing a comforting hand on Julian's shoulder. "Jules, how are you holding up? And how is our little angel today?" he asked, his gaze flicking briefly towards Lily before dismissing her. "That's what I wanted to discuss," Julian began, his voice dangerously calm. He gestured for them to sit. "I've been reviewing Lily's early files. Her first diagnosis, it was different. Elective mutism, it said, not degenerative." Dr. Finch's professional smile didn't waver, but a subtle tension entered his frame. "Ah, yes, an initial and sadly incorrect assessment. In complex trauma cases, symptoms can be misleading. As we observed her further, the true underlying pathology became clear. It's a tragic but not uncommon progression." "And the medications?" Julian pressed, holding the doctor's gaze. "The heavy antipsychotics, they seem extreme for a child whose initial prognosis was good." "Extreme situations call for extreme measures, Julian," Marcus interjected smoothly, his voice a soothing balm. "Dr. Finch saved her from a state of constant agitation. You remember how it was. He brought her peace." Julian looked from Marcus's earnest, concerned face to Dr. Finch's clinical mask, and for the first time he saw the lie. He saw the performance. Clara, standing by the window, watched Marcus. She saw the way his eyes never truly settled on Lily, the way his concern for Julian seemed theatrical, and the almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth as Julian questioned the diagnosis. That night, the first report from the investigators came in. Dr. Finch had a history. 2 prior malpractice suits, both settled out of court and sealed. Whispers of a gambling addiction, a lifestyle that far exceeded a pediatric specialist's salary. And then the bombshell. Financial analysis revealed a series of large, untraceable payments made to an offshore account in Finch's name, beginning the same month he took over Lily's care. The source of the funds was a shell corporation, a corporation that, after 3 days of relentless digging, the investigators traced back to its ultimate owner, Marcus Thorne. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening force, but the motive remained elusive, a dark, gaping hole in the center of the conspiracy. Why would Marcus, his friend of 20 years, the man who was like an uncle to Lily, do something so monstrous? The answer came from a place Julian had locked away, a memory he had refused to examine. He and Clara were in his study late at night, the damning financial report spread across his desk. "Why?" Julian whispered, the word a raw sound of pain. Why would he do this to her? Clara, thinking of the photograph of Lily and her mother, asked a simple question. "Mr. Thorne, was he close with your wife, sir?" Julian froze, and the memory, sealed behind the wall of his grief, broke free. It was from a party, a year before Amelia's death. He had been late, as usual. He had walked onto the terrace to find Marcus and Amelia in a heated, hushed argument. Amelia was crying. Marcus was holding her arm, his face intense, pleading. "He doesn't deserve you, Amy," Marcus had said. "He's never here. He doesn't see you. I would." Julian had stepped in, and the moment had shattered. Marcus had recoiled. Amelia had wiped her tears, and it was never spoken of again. He had dismissed it as a moment of drunken sentimentality. Now he saw it for what it was. Marcus was in love with his wife, a desperate, unrequited love that had curdled into obsession. "He blames me," Julian said, the realization dawning with chilling clarity. "He blames me for her death. He thinks my work, my absences, drove her to the depression that led to her accident." He looked up at Clara, his face a canvas of horror. "This isn't about money. This is revenge. He couldn't have Amelia, so he's destroying the only part of her I have left. He's not just letting Lily fade away. He's torturing me by making me watch it happen day after day." The full scope of the evil was laid bare. Marcus hadn't just betrayed a friendship. He had orchestrated a living nightmare, using Julian's grief as a weapon against him, turning his home into a prison and his daughter into a ghost. And the man who sat on the local Superior Court bench, Judge Harrington, the man Marcus played golf with every Thursday. Julian now understood with icy dread that he was just another piece on Marcus's board, another pawn in a long, cruel game. Marcus Thorne was no fool. He had built his career on anticipating the moves of corporate raiders and market fluctuations. He felt the shift in Julian's attitude like a change in barometric pressure. The questions, the sudden interest in old files, the new unsettling bond between the millionaire, his daughter, and the housekeeper. It was a threat to the perfect static misery he had so carefully constructed. He knew he had to act, and his weapon of choice was the one he had always used, the subtle poisoning of trust. His target was Clara. She was the catalyst, the variable he hadn't accounted for. She had to be removed. He chose his moment perfectly. Julian was consumed by the investigation, spending long hours on the phone with his lawyers and PIs. The mansion's atmosphere was thick with a new unspoken tension. Marcus engineered his plan with the same cold precision he applied to a hostile takeover. He acquired one of Amelia's most cherished pieces of jewelry from the vault, a sapphire and diamond necklace Julian had given her for their last anniversary. It was an iconic piece, one Julian would recognize instantly. The next day, while Clara was in the solarium with Lily, Marcus slipped into her small, neat room in the staff quarters. It took him less than 30 seconds. He opened her wardrobe, tucked the necklace deep into the pocket of an old coat and left without a trace. The performance that evening was worthy of an award. He found Julian in his study, pacing like a caged animal. "Jules," Marcus said, his voice laced with feigned reluctance and sorrow, "there's something I have to tell you. I didn't want to believe it." He explained that he'd gone to the vault to retrieve a document and had noticed the empty velvet box. He had checked the security logs. No forced entry. The only people with access were Julian himself and Mrs. Gable, whose key was purely for emergencies. "It has to be someone on the inside, Jules," Marcus concluded, his face a mask of pained sympathy. "The new housekeeper. She's had the run of the house. She's gotten so close to you." Julian's first instinct was a violent, absolute denial, not Clara. It was impossible. But Marcus was relentless, planting seeds of doubt with practiced ease. "Think about it, Jules. A woman with no background who suddenly has the complete trust of a billionaire. It's the oldest story in the book. Perhaps this whole breakthrough with Lily was just a way to get closer, to gain your confidence." The poison worked because it played on Julian's deepest insecurities. His guilt as a father, his history of trusting the wrong people, his fear that this fragile new hope was just another illusion destined to be shattered. Reluctantly, his mind clouded with a toxic mix of suspicion and dread, he agreed to a search. Marcus, ever helpful, insisted on being present to ensure it was done discreetly. They started with Clara's room. The discovery was swift and brutal. Marcus reached into the coat pocket and pulled out the glittering necklace. It lay coiled in his palm, sapphires like chips of ice, diamonds like frozen tears. The sight of it, Amelia's necklace, in this context, broke something in Julian. For a moment the investigator, the warrior father, vanished, and the grieving, betrayed husband took his place. Clara was summoned. She walked into the room to find Julian holding the necklace, his face pale and unreadable, and Marcus looking at her with an expression of profound disappointment. "I don't understand," she said, her voice quiet, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked at Marcus and saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes. She knew in that instant she had been framed. The police were called. The process was a blur of brutal efficiency. Marcus had already laid the groundwork. He spoke to the responding officers in hushed, urgent tones, painting a picture of a vulnerable, grieving family preyed upon by a cunning thief. He mentioned his connections, his friendship with Judge Harrington. The system, so often slow and ponderous, moved with the speed and lethality of a striking snake. Clara was arrested. She was a black woman with a modest public defender, accused of stealing from a powerful white billionaire. Her protests of innocence were treated as predictable and irrelevant. The bail was set at an impossibly high amount. Julian, lost in a fog of confusion, grief, and Marcus's insidious whispers, did nothing. He stood by as the linchpin of his newfound hope was led away in handcuffs. The hearing was a sham. Judge Harrington presided, his face a stony mask of impartiality that fooled no one. The evidence was presented, the necklace found in her room, her status as a new employee with unprecedented access. Clara's public defender was overwhelmed and outmaneuvered. Within days, in a swift and merciless judgment, Judge Harrington sentenced Clara Mayweather to 15 years in the state penitentiary for grand larceny. As the verdict was read, Clara looked at Julian, who sat in the gallery, his face hidden in his hands. Her expression was not one of anger, but of deep, profound sorrow, not for herself, but for him and for the little girl she was being forced to leave behind. The last piece of Marcus's plan fell into place. He visited the mansion the day after the sentencing. He found Lily back in her corner, the fog having descended once more, thicker than ever. The wooden bird lay on the floor beside her chair, where it had fallen from her limp hand. "You see, Jules," Marcus said softly, his arm around Julian's shoulders, "I told you she was a disruptive influence. The poor child is so fragile. Now that the chaos is gone, she can finally be at peace." Julian looked at his daughter, at her vacant eyes and slack face, and the peace Marcus spoke of looked chillingly like death. The lie was complete. The prison was secure once more. The silence that descended upon the Sterling mansion after Clara's departure was heavier and more profound than before. It was the silence of a tomb resealed. Julian Sterling walked the halls like a ghost, the brief, brilliant flicker of hope now extinguished, leaving behind an acrid smoke of guilt and despair. He had allowed it to happen. He had stood by while the one person who had reached his daughter was swallowed by a system he knew to be corruptible, a system his supposed best friend had expertly manipulated. Marcus Thorne's victory was absolute. He was a constant, soothing presence, managing Julian's affairs, overseeing the house, and ensuring the clinical sterile routine around Lily was reestablished with grim efficiency. Dr. Finch made a house call, adjusted Lily's medication, increasing the dosage, and pronounced her stabilized. But Julian saw the truth. Lily wasn't stable. She was erased. The light in her eyes was gone. She no longer responded to the sunbeams or the scent of flowers. She was a porcelain doll again, beautiful and empty. The wooden bird Clara had given her lay on a table untouched. The sight of it was a constant, stabbing accusation. The breaking point came a week after the sentencing. Julian was in his study, staring at the financial reports that proved Marcus's betrayal, the evidence he had failed to act on. The pieces were all there, but his grief and Marcus's masterful manipulation had blinded him. He looked at the photograph of a smiling, vibrant Amelia and felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. He had failed her in life, and now he was failing their daughter in the aftermath of her death. He went to Lily's room. She was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face pale in the dim light. The nurse on duty was reading a magazine, barely glancing up. An inferno of rage, cold and pure, ignited in Julian's soul. This was his home, his daughter. He would not let this stand. His transformation was no longer gradual. It was a seismic event. The cold, detached billionaire, the grieving husband, the manipulated friend, all were burned away in the fire of his newfound purpose. In their place stood a father, a protector, a man who would move heaven and earth for his child and for the innocent woman he had wronged. The next morning, Julian Sterling went to war. He made a single phone call to a man named Elias Vance, the most feared and respected appellate lawyer in the state, a man who feasted on injustice and corrupt judges. He transferred $10 million into Vance's retainer account before the call was even finished. "I want you to burn them to the ground," Julian's voice was quiet, but it held the chilling promise of utter devastation. "Thorne, Finch, and Judge Harrington, I want their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined, and their freedom taken. And I want Clara Mayweather out, yesterday." He then unleashed his team of private investigators with a new mandate and an unlimited budget. They were no longer just gathering information. They were hunting. They dug into Judge Harrington's finances, his rulings, his personal life. They re-interviewed the nurses who had worked in the house, offering substantial rewards for information. They put a tail on Marcus Thorne, documenting his every move. A crucial piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Gable, the rigid head housekeeper, requested a meeting with Julian. She had always been loyal to the memory of Amelia and had harbored a deep instinctual distrust of Marcus Thorne's oily charm. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her hands clasped tightly, "the day that necklace disappeared, I saw Mr. Thorne. He was coming from the direction of the staff wing. I thought it was odd. He never goes there." Her testimony on its own was circumstantial, but it was the first crack in Marcus's carefully constructed alibi. It was corroboration. While the legal and investigative machinery churned, Julian focused on the most important battle, the one for his daughter. He fired the nursing agency and dismissed Dr. Finch, barring him from the property. He took over Lily's care himself. He sat with her for hours, day after day, in the solarium. The room had begun to fade again without Clara's touch, but Julian did his best. He watered the plants. He let the sun in. He held the small wooden bird in his own hand, showing it to Lily. He talked to her, telling her about her mother, about his work, about how sorry he was. And he hummed. He was a terrible singer, his voice flat and uncertain, but he hummed the 5-note lullaby Clara had sung. He hummed it until his throat was raw, pouring all of his regret, his love, and his desperate hope into the simple melody. For days there was nothing. Lily remained lost in the fog, but Julian was relentless. He would not give up. He was fighting for 2 lives now, his daughter's, and the one he had allowed to be stolen from Clara. The war was being waged on 2 fronts, one in the courts and the back alleys of information brokering, and the other in a quiet, sunlit room with a lullaby as its only weapon. The emergency appeal hearing was scheduled. Elias Vance, a silver-haired shark with a deceptively gentle demeanor, had worked miracles, filing motions that exposed procedural errors in Clara's sham trial and presenting preliminary evidence of judicial misconduct on the part of Harrington. The hearing wasn't to retry the case, but to argue for Clara's conviction to be overturned and for a new trial to be granted. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. The courtroom was a tense, sterile theater. Marcus Thorne was there, sitting behind the prosecutor's table, the picture of a concerned friend of the court. Judge Harrington was not presiding, but his shadow loomed large over the proceedings. Clara was brought in, wearing a drab prison uniform, looking thinner and paler. But her eyes, when they met Julian's, held not accusation, but a quiet, steady strength. Vance's first witness was a former nurse, a woman named Sarah, whom the investigators had tracked down in another state. She had been fired by Dr. Finch after she questioned the high dosage of antipsychotics for a child like Lily. It was chemical restraint, plain and simple, she testified, her voice clear and confident. I told Dr. Finch I was concerned it would cause long-term harm. He told me I was to follow his orders or find another job. I was fired the next day. Next came the forensic accountants, who laid out a dizzying, undeniable trail of money flowing from Marcus Thorne's shell corporations into the accounts of Dr. Finch, and, through a series of intermediaries, to a company owned by Judge Harrington's brother-in-law. The prosecution objected furiously, but the appellate judge, a stern, unflappable woman named Diaz, allowed it. The foundation of the conspiracy was being laid bare for all to see. But Vance knew it wasn't enough. It was a compelling case for a new trial, but he needed something to shatter the entire facade, something immediate and irrefutable. Against all advice from his legal team, Julian had decided to play his final, most desperate card. During a brief recess, a wheelchair was brought into the courtroom. In it sat Lily Sterling. She was listless, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes unfocused, a perfect exhibit of the prosecution's narrative of a profoundly disabled child. Marcus watched, a flicker of unease in his eyes, but he likely assumed Julian was making a foolish, emotional play, demonstrating the child's fragility. Clara was brought back to the defendant's table. As she entered the room, her eyes fell on Lily, and for the first time that day, a change occurred on the witness stand of human emotion. Lily's head, which had been lolling slightly to one side, lifted. Her gaze, previously vacant, moved and locked onto Clara. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. Judge Diaz leaned forward, her expression intent. Vance let the moment hang in the air, a silent, powerful testament. Then he nodded to Julian. Julian walked over to his daughter's side. He knelt down, his gaze soft, his movements gentle. He ignored the judge, the lawyers, the entire world. He looked into his daughter's eyes and began to hum. The 5 simple notes of the lullaby filled the tense silence of the courtroom. It was off-key, breathy, but full of love. Lily's eyes, which had been fixed on Clara, shifted to her father. She looked at his face, then looked back at Clara, a connection being visibly forged between the 3 of them. Marcus Thorne was half risen from his seat, his face ashen, a dawning horror spreading across his features. "Your Honor, this is a circus," the prosecutor exclaimed, but Judge Diaz silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. "Let him continue." Julian finished the melody. He looked at Lily, his heart in his throat. "Lilybug," he whispered, using a pet name from long ago. "Can you say it? Can you tell them?" Lily looked at the woman in the prison uniform, the woman who had brought her light and sound and warmth. Her lips parted. A small breathy sound came out, and then, in a voice that was wavering, fragile but perfectly, miraculously clear, she spoke her first word in over 2 years. "Clara." The word, so simple, so pure, detonated in the silent courtroom with the force of a bomb. It was vindication. It was truth. It was the irrefutable testimony of a witness no one had thought to call. Marcus Thorne sank back into his chair as if struck. The prosecutor stood, mouth agape. Elias Vance allowed a small, tight smile to touch his lips. Clara Mayweather closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. Julian wrapped his arms around his daughter, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with silent, cathartic sobs. Judge Diaz stared at the scene for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the prosecutor, at the ashen-faced Marcus Thorne, and finally at her clerk. "In light of this extraordinary development," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "the conviction of Ms. Clara Mayweather is hereby vacated. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. She is to be released immediately." She then turned her steely gaze towards Marcus. "And I am issuing a bench warrant for the immediate arrest of Marcus Thorne and Dr. Alistair Finch on suspicion of conspiracy and aggravated assault. Pending a full investigation, this court is adjourned." Chaos erupted, but through it all 2 moments of pure clarity shone. The first was the sight of court officers placing handcuffs on a stunned Marcus Thorne. The second, more powerful still, was Clara, now free, walking towards the wheelchair and kneeling opposite Julian, their hands meeting over Lily's. The child looked from one to the other, and for the first time in years, the corners of her mouth turned up in a small, radiant smile. 2 years later, the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sound of laughter, the pitter-patter of running feet, and the occasional joyous melody played on the grand piano. Sunlight, no longer held at bay by heavy drapes, streamed through the clean windows, illuminating rooms filled with color, comfortable furniture, and the happy clutter of a child's life. The solarium, once a forgotten relic, was now the heart of the home, a lush tropical paradise where an 8-year-old girl with dark hair and bright, intelligent eyes loved to read stories. Lily Sterling was thriving. The years of chemical imprisonment had left their mark. She had developmental delays and required specialized therapy. But her spirit, so long caged, was vibrant and indomitable. She spoke in full, complex sentences, had a wicked sense of humor, and a deep, abiding love for drawing, her pictures covering the refrigerator and the walls of her room. She was, in every sense, the girl from the photograph brought back to life. The men who had tried to erase her were gone. Marcus Thorne was serving a 40-year sentence for conspiracy, kidnapping, and a host of financial crimes uncovered during the investigation. His revenge had consumed him, leaving him with nothing. Dr. Alistair Finch had testified against Marcus in exchange for a lighter sentence and had lost his medical license permanently. Judge Harrington, disgraced and disbarred, was awaiting his own federal trial for judicial corruption. Justice, slow and grinding, had been served. Julian Sterling was also a changed man. He had sold off the most demanding divisions of his company, trading boardrooms and billion-dollar deals for school pickups and bedtime stories. The haunted, work-obsessed ghost had been replaced by a present, patient, and deeply loving father. He had learned that his true fortune was not in his stock portfolio, but in the warmth of his daughter's hand in his. Clara Mayweather was the anchor of this new world. She was no longer the housekeeper. She was the firm, gentle, and loving center of their family. She had guided Lily's recovery with the same intuitive grace she had shown from the very beginning, and in healing the child, she had healed the deep wounds of her own past. The love she had lost had found a new, miraculous place to grow. The final scene of their transformation took place on a warm autumn afternoon in the mansion's sprawling garden. It was not a grand affair, but a small, intimate ceremony attended by a few close friends, Elias Vance and a repentant Mrs. Gable. Julian, looking sharp and happier than he had in a decade, stood under a flower-laden archway. Lily, acting as the flower girl, walked down a path of scattered rose petals, clutching not her worn wooden bird, but a small, new, and equally treasured stuffed horse. She beamed, her smile a beacon of pure joy. Then came Clara, radiant in a simple, elegant dress, her eyes locked on Julian. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, words not of flowery romance, but of profound gratitude, of partnership, and of a shared promise to protect the family they had forged from the ashes of betrayal and grief. As Julian slid a ring onto Clara's finger, he looked from his new wife to his precious daughter. His heart, once a cold, barren thing, was full to bursting. He saw the two women who had saved him from himself, who had taught him the true meaning of strength and love. They were his home. They were his redemption. The quiet joy of that moment was a testament to the idea that even in the face of the most calculated cruelty, the truth, nurtured by patience and courage, will eventually find its voice. It proved that justice is not always about punishment, but about restoration, and that the strongest families are often the ones we build, not the ones we are born into. Before we say our final goodbye, remember to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up if it touched your heart. And please share in the comments where you're watching from. We are grateful for every single one of you.